Welcome to the Peak Mental Performance Podcast with Joe Shalero, optimizing your mental health and athletic performance one episode at a time.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Peak Mental Performance Podcast. I have with me today Dr. Dominic DAgostino. He is an associate professor of molecular pharmacology and physiology at the University of South Florida College of Medicine. He's a research scientist who also does a lot of developing and testing of metabolic-based therapies, including ketogenic diets and exogenous ketone agents, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, that target specific pathways linked with seizure disorders, neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, muscle wasting, exercise performance, all kinds of stuff. He's done research with the DoD, NASA, a whole bunch of different things. And from this on this topic of ketogenic dieting, I think most of our listeners are probably have at least heard of it before. The kind of quick and dirty context explanation that we'll get into more details for those listening is, a ketogenic diet is going to be where you're consuming so few carbohydrates where your body starts producing ketones and starts oxidizing fatty acids as fuel. And there's a whole lot of different things that are essentially kickstarted by that as Dr. DAgostino works with here. So my initial, people have the context from my perspective too, of I had always, in working in fitness and wellness, had heard about ketogenic diets and just the framework of fat loss of, it turns your body into a fat burning machine and just kind of that side of things. And had never been one of my top priorities to be working on, to focus on. But then recently, over the last couple years, and especially the last few months, I started hearing Dom talk with some different podcasts about the neurological effects, even beyond what was historically known about seizure disorders with the ketogenic diet. And that's what kind of piqued my interest, and obviously is in the context of this podcast. So thanks for being with us to chat today, Dom.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
So, speaking of the neurological side of the effects of a ketogenic diet, you began working with ketogenic research as a means to treat drug-resistant seizures in a unique population. Could you talk a little bit about that and kind of what in that experience kind of kickstarted you to that becoming really the bulk of what you're studying now and the effects of that? Yeah,
sure. So, I was classically trained in neuroscience. I did my PhD in neuroscience, like doing electrical recordings on brain cells, a technique called patch clamping, and looking at the effects of low oxygen on the brain and how the brain responds to that. And my postdoctoral fellowship was actually a grant. After submitting a number of grants that got rejected, I hit on one that was pretty big, and it was for the Office of Navy Research. And it was to look at and understand why people that are subjected to high pressure oxygen, and there's not a whole lot of people that would be subjected to, high pressure oxygen. It's kind of a rare condition. So hyperbaric oxygen therapy would be one situation, and another would be using a specialized equipment called a closed circuit oxygen rebreather that the Special Operations Forces use. And they use it for their operations. There's a stealth component to it, because when you're breathing underwater, instead of, with scuba, you have lots of bubbles are forming, and it can be used to identify your location. Whereas a rebreather is very quiet and doesn't release bubbles. So it becomes a very important piece of equipment. The problem is when you're breathing 100% oxygen in these types of equipment, oxygen is a stimulant to the brain, and if you go down too deep, the partial pressure of oxygen increases in the breathing gas. Because there's, as you go deeper, every 10 meters is 1 atmosphere, right? So right now we have the pressure of 1 atmosphere on us if we're at sea level. If you go down to 10 meters of seawater, that's another complete atmosphere of pressure pushing down on us. So another 14.7 psi of pressure. So that makes the oxygen concentration in your breathing gas more, and that increases the oxygen concentration in your brain, which is a stimulant, and that may have some therapeutic applications we could talk about from hyperbaric oxygen therapy perspective. But if you go down to 5 atmospheres, which is kind of what we use in our model systems, you can produce a seizure typically in about 5 to 10 minutes. So that was, I was sort of tasked with understanding why these seizures occur, how to predict them, and how to prevent them. And most of my focus was really on drug research. And it was understood that using anti-epileptic drugs or anti-seizure medication in a warfighter population had the potential, they have a lot of side effects, so you have the potential to impair cognitive and physical performance. And that's not ideal, especially, if they're going into their mission. So I became, and the types of seizures are very powerful tonic-clonic seizures, and they're largely drug resistant, at least in animal models. So seizure models in rodents are actually pretty good predictors of how the drugs will work in humans, unlike things like cancer models aren't always, they're informative but not always predictive. Well, animal model studies using various drugs are pretty predictive, informative and predictive from rodent models to humans. So I started looking into, well, what do people do who have drug resistant or drug refractory epilepsy? The drugs just don't work, or they just stop working. And I discovered the ketogenic diet, which I knew about just being a nutrition and kind of fitness enthusiast back in my undergrad. I even studied that at Rutgers, where I went. I studied that in biology, and I went on to physiology and neuroscience, but never really stayed with nutrition until I realized that the ketogenic diet seems to be working better to control powerful tonic-clonic seizures better than all the other things I was looking into. So so upon, after being funded a number of years, I was able to convince our Office of Navy Research, which is part of the Department of Defense, the program officer, to fund a study that would evaluate this idea of nutritional ketosis as a mitigation strategy or countermeasure to high pressure oxygen, and determine if it could delay the onset of CNS oxygen toxicity. And we created some unique technologies, in our lab, where we can do that in cell-based assay systems, or we can do whole animal physiology studies, in the lab, and look at things, and monitor the heart rate, monitor respiration, monitor EEG activity, do metabolomics on the blood, and evaluate and give various agents or diets that would ideally, what they want to do is acutely stimulate or produce nutritional ketosis just prior to the dive. So in talking with some of the clinicians and different teams that work in a university setting that work with patients, it does take a while to implement the ketogenic diet and get into a state of nutritional ketosis, but it's remarkably effective, even in cases, 60% of cases that are drug refractory, you have people that are highly responsive to the ketogenic diet. So, I embarked on this journey to determine what would be the optimal way to produce nutritional ketosis and have a rapid onset, and to be able to sustain it for a number of hours that would correlate to a mission operation. So the ketogenic diet was a hard sell to the military at the time, and now they're actually looking into it a little bit more as more research is coming out. So what they really wanted was a ketogenic diet in a pill, and a substance that could elevate ketone bodies, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and be able to change the neuropharmacology of the brain to make it more resilient in this environment of extreme oxidative stress, high pressure oxygen. So we kind of did the foundational work to understand what molecule would be most neuroprotective in that setting, and then and now we're looking at kind of various molecules and formulations of molecules, and also the mechanism. So we can kind of, in many ways, maybe reverse engineer or titrate in different formulations to optimize it. And now we're also, extending our animal work into human studies, where we are in the context of a university being able to do human research subjects come in and monitor brain activity in response to high pressure oxygen in the absence and presence of being in nutritional ketosis. So we're doing that now. And also my work translated to a project that I did with NASA where I was a crew member for NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations 22, also called NEMO 22. And in that series of experiments we did, it was in an underwater habitat in an extreme environment where we lived in saturation. So the saturation environment, I talked about, if you go down every couple of meters, well, we were about 3 atmospheres of pressure. And instead of a submarine where you're living in 1 atmosphere and it can go down to hundreds of feet or thousands, the environment that I was in, the pressure in the air was the same pressure outside into the water habitat. So we're breathing high pressure and not going up to the surface as you would do in scuba. Right. So when you live in saturation, it involves a fairly complicated decompression protocol to get back up to the surface. Right. So NASA uses this as a space analog. And this allows us for me to test nutritional ketosis, to test different supplements, to do things like look at the microbiome, wear gadgets so I can measure my sleep activity, heart rate variability, blood metabolites. NASA gives us a whole bunch of things to do, engineering things and testing different things. We did various exercise equipment to determine form on the squat, to determine form on deadlifts and things like that. And that equipment goes up to the space station to ensure that astronauts are doing the exercise right and they're not going to hurt themselves. So it's pretty cool to do all these different tasks. And so that's kind of like where going back into nutritional ketosis took me. I mean, because NASA got interested in this, in our research because of our lab here, but also because of the countermeasures that we were developing that would allow the aquanauts, if you're underwater more than 24 hours, you become an aquanaut, operational divers, recreational divers, and also astronauts to provide an environment where they would be safer and an environment where they could increase their performance. And I guess the term would be performance resilience, because your performance breaks down pretty fast if the oxygen concentration decreases, say if you're at altitude or if you're doing in a space environment and the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, for example, if there was that situation, or your performance and safety can break down pretty fast if you become under nitrogen narcosis or you're under a high pressure oxygen environment. So, and we have unique equipment that can study that. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, probably more information than you wanted to know.
No,
but
good.
How I got steered into this from, my PhD was doing very fundamental patch clamp electrophysiology, but it is translated from cell-based systems to a variety of animal model systems where we study a variety of neurological diseases that I can talk about, things like wound healing and cancer and muscle wasting associated with that, to now, we're doing human studies where I'm the subject in some of the studies, and we're applying that things that we developed in the lab in the actual operational environment, which is really exciting to me. So looking back, it's really fun to be able to be physically part of the research. And I'm always testing various things on myself too. So yeah. I'm kind of my own experiment in progress too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's been really interesting to, I've spent some time listening to different interviews you did and to see that progression even in the last few years of some of the things that were like in their infancy, and it's continued to progress so much and build bigger. And I think for people listening, particularly that are in athletics, things like that, it's interesting to see where this goes, because you look at some of those experiments that you've done with these high stress on the brain, and we look at things like CTE in athletes or traumatic brain injury, or, there's so much in even a lot of mental health and neurological disorders where we still are kind of in our infancy of understanding the exact mechanisms to where those are. So it's been interesting to see, well, if nutritional ketosis or now working with exogenous ketones, if that's helping be neuroprotective and restore brain homeostasis and protect against these seizures, to see what other areas of neurological conditions that might benefit. So like, what are some other neurological things aside from the drug-resistant seizures that you've been seeing now a ketogenic diet start to potentially benefit?
Yeah, it's an expanding list, a greatly expanding list. So I will the first thing that I actually started out studying was the first project I was involved in is Alzheimer's disease. So with Alzheimer's disease, you have an accumulation of amyloid and tau plaques that occur. And we don't actually know, the etiology of Alzheimer's disease. If you're, ApoE4 positive, then you're more likely to get it. But we think that there's evidence to suggest, and we have colleagues that study this, they study the mitochondria in Alzheimer's disease, that there are metabolic defects and there's compromised energy metabolism that precedes the onset of Alzheimer's pathology, or even signs of the Alzheimer's disease, and even the accumulation of the amyloid and tau plaques, right? So I got into studying that maybe 2008 or 9, where we did, various mouse models of Alzheimer's disease. And I know Richard Veach at the NIH had also published the ketone ester, and that it worked remarkably well in his study. I think they had the triple transgenic mouse model. Again, these mouse models, are informative but not always predictive. And then at the time that we were setting up to do these experiments, and even I would say a lot of motivation for doing this, or inspiration for doing this, was a colleague of mine, Dr. Mary Newport, and her husband, Steve Newport, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and was using medium chain triglyceride oil and coconut oil, and came in to do, he qualified for a clinical trial, and he was being assessed in various measures, including the clock test and the mini mental status test. And upon acute ingestion of medium chain triglycerides and coconut oil, he had a pretty dramatic increase in his ability to, in his mini mental status test, and also in his clock test. And this was documented as in a case report, and colleagues that were working in Alzheimer's research, brought me into it because I was kind of the diet guy studying ketones. And this really inspired me. Mary Newport's a very close friend now. She wrote a book, Alzheimer's, What If There Was a Cure, and documented it. And it was with colleagues at NIH that actually published the case report of her husband, who lived many years. He was diagnosed, when he started this, he had pretty severe Alzheimer's disease. And it improved him to the point where he became animated, he could talk, he could communicate for a number of years. And I met him in 2008 or 9, and it was a number of years where he maintained that and and stayed, fairly stable for a number of years until he had a few setbacks for different reasons. But Dr. Newport got a lot of extra years, with her husband for that, and he passed away a year or so ago. But it was quite a long time. He lived and actually improved significantly in the beginning. And that was just coconut oil and MCT oil. And then he did later transition into using a ketone ester, and a peer-reviewed clinical study was published on that with the National Institutes of Health. And that was really motivation for me to study this idea of the ketogenic diet. It was well respected, I would say, metabolic-based therapy for drug-resistant seizures of all types. And even now we know absence seizures respond very well to that. But and people still don't understand how it works, but it was my opinion and my perspective that it was improving brain energy metabolism, because when you have the etiology of seizures is largely unknown, but it's generally accepted that if you inject someone with insulin or something, and you have peripheral glucose disposal, and you have lack of glucose to the brain, you can trigger a seizure. There's a lot of different scenarios. If you have neuroinflammation, it disrupts brain energy metabolism. It triggers a seizure. There's all these different glucose transporter deficiency syndrome. It triggers seizures. So it was very it made sense to me that it was restoring normal brain energy metabolism and kind of restoring the homeostasis of the brain, right? So it would make sense that it should be the ketogenic diet, or I should reframe it, a number of neurological diseases. The etiology is the pathophysiology, I should say, is linked to impaired brain energy metabolism. And the ketogenic diet was directly providing an alternative energy substrate that could restore and help balance brain energy metabolism and even balance neurotransmitters in the brain. So at a very early time frame, we're in 2017 now, at around 2009 and 10, I had this idea. I was connecting with all these different people studying everything under the sun and saying, have you thought about the ketogenic diet? Have you thought about exogenous ketones for this or that? And when I started studying, it was pediatric epilepsy. It was really the only thing that the ketogenic diet was used for. And now, there's reviews written on the subject. There's peer-reviewed studies and animal models and even registered clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov on so many different applications now for the ketogenic diet. So, you asked about, autism, ALS, absence seizures is something that we published recently on. Anxiety is something that we recently published on. Glucose transporter deficiency, we study that. Traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency syndrome, which I think we could talk about even in the context as it applies to athletes maybe. There's a whole bunch of different neuro diseases, and now you have weight loss and type 2 diabetes may actually be like the low-hanging fruit study, and Virta Health is doing a great job at that. With that, Jeff Volek's company is connecting and have built a platform where if you have type 2 diabetes, you can work with a team of registered dietitians that are savvy with the ketogenic diet to put your type 2 diabetes into remission in a relatively short time frame, or either dramatically reduce the amount of medication that you're taking or get off medication altogether. So they've already presented some preliminary, it's peer reviewed, so not even preliminary. They've already presented some data that's very dramatic. If you could package the ketogenic diet in a drug, the pharmaceutical companies would be all over this. Right. It's that effective for things like type 2 diabetes. And the way I think about it is that if you are getting your metabolic health under control and optimized throughout midlife especially, and you start when you're young, that you're delaying the onset of age-related chronic diseases dramatically. So you're extending the health span of people dramatically when you're doing that. And that's why I see the real utility of the ketogenic diet. I use it personally because it makes me more productive and I have more energy and I like the foods. So I use it. But I think if you can get people to change their diets and think of the ketogenic diet as a tool that can possibly enhance their metabolic wellness, that's a really important thing to give to people, because a lot of people don't necessarily know that a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet would be healthy to follow. Most of the advice would be contrary to that. So they're very hesitant, and their doctors are very hesitant, and with good reason, because we're taught that the diet could be very unhealthy and even dangerous. But it depends on the individual and depends on how you formulate the ketogenic diet. There's so many factors involved.
Yeah, I was explaining that somebody was asking me the other day about some of the ketogenic stuff, and I was discussing some of the health benefits, and I think sometimes as people have to understand too, there's a difference between eating a ketogenic diet where you're just wrapping up processed sausage and cheese and eating it versus buying some other types of foods and eating grass-fed meats and things like that. So I think sometimes it seems to get lumped together sometimes, which is probably some of what people's misconceptions are.
And a ketogenic diet, just like to make this point that it's a very high-fat diet that's 80 to 90% from the classical ketogenic diet. So it's when people talk about the ketogenic diet, it's most likely they're not really, they're looking at things like the modified ketogenic diet, also called the modified Atkins. Now, Eric Kossoff at Johns Hopkins has really advanced this idea of using a more liberal, a less restrictive form of the ketogenic diet, and has even published on that you get many or most of the benefits of nutritional ketosis using a diet that's not 90 or 80% fat, but you can back it off to 65 or 70% fat and making the balance, more protein. So that has made it much more feasible. And that is actually for adults that are being, treated with epilepsy and given this option, they are pushed towards a modified ketogenic diet and not the classical ketogenic diet that was used for decades. So that's an important distinction.
And that's more feasible for athletes too that are that are performing intense activity.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so you discussed the etiology of a few of these different conditions. How much, and I'm sure it's kind of a mix for certain conditions, but things like, say, anxiety, where there's some research that shows that fluctuations in insulin and blood sugar can affect that, but then there's also sides of the actual brain itself. How much do you think in a lot of these neurological conditions is it the absence of a lot of blood sugar and insulin fluctuations, or is it the actual ketones themselves performing a mechanism that's providing a lot of this benefit, or is it kind of a combination of both, you think?
Yeah, I think it is a combination of both. And in my talk, the lectures that I give, I'll throw up a slide that shows all the mechanisms of the ketogenic diet, and there's many mechanisms working in synchrony. We do know from just basic biochemistry work that has been done and metabolic physiology work that has been done, and a lot of this work doesn't, really go on today, or maybe it's getting more of a resurgence, but we know that you can increase the ATP levels in if tissues are perfused with or subjected to ketone bodies, beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate as a fuel source instead of an equimolar amount of glucose, right? It's probably to optimize this, it's probably multiple fuel sources, would enhance ATP production and also enhance that ATP production under periods of stress, right? So there's various model systems where you give ketones and then you stimulate cellular oxidative stress, or you give a neurotoxin, or you give glutamate or high potassium, things that would put energetic demands on the cells, and the cells can survive and they have a better resilience in that oxidative environment if they're burning ketones. So we have, enhanced ATP production is one thing that ketones can do. A reduction in mitochondrial superoxide or reactive oxygen species is reduced when cells use ketones as an energy source, because it enhances the flow of electrons through the electron transport chain by oxidizing Q, and it makes it less possible to make one of the precursor reactive oxygen species, the free radicals, superoxide. So it enhances that, and if you make less free radicals, then you are dampening the oxidative stress of the entire cell, and even in the microenvironment of the mitochondria. So that has been, there's people who just study that. We look at that a little bit. So there's an elevation of GABA, so the calming neurotransmitter. And the ratio, and we've looked at this and published on it, the ratio of glutamate to GABA is decreased, or I should say the ratio of GABA to glutamate is increased, right? We have more GABA relative to glutamate. So your brain will take alpha ketoglutamate to make glutamate, and then glutamate is converted to GABA through glutamic acid decarboxylase. It's an enzyme that's actually activated on folks or animals when they are on a ketogenic diet. So you convert more of that excitatory neurotransmitter that can even be neurotoxic, and it's way elevated with people who have seizures, people have traumatic brain injury, conditions like this, and you convert more of that excitatory neurotransmitter into an inhibitory neurotransmitter, or I should say like a brain stabilizing neurotransmitter. So GABA works by like chloride mediated postsynaptic inhibition, which basically means it opens up ion channels that hyperpolarize the membrane potential and prevents the brain from firing extra electrical signals that it otherwise would be if it's bombarded with lots of glutamate and activating glutamate receptors. So it counteracts that. So it can be very neuroprotective for that. And a lot of anti-epilepsy drugs like a bunch of like vigabatrin work by stimulating more GABA, but they do it in a way that could be toxic. Like, a side effect of vigabatrin is it's a small amount of people who get the side effect, but you become blind and it's irreversible. So you don't want that. And that's actually one of the drugs of choice for like a disabled submarine scenario where you have to denitrogenate people to get them up to the surface. Like vigabatrin is in that toolbox of things, because it's a drug, it works fast.
Right.
But we think we're changing that paradigm where ketones can be, in that the drug of the substance of choice in that toolbox. So we've also demonstrated that adenosine goes way up with the ketogenic. So this is something that was a little bit unexpected, but adenosine's a vasodilator. And it may, people who are elderly, who have impaired cognitive function as they age, it could be a vascular problem. And if you follow the ketogenic diet, the ketones increase the amount of adenosine, which has a vasodilation effect, which you have more blood flow going to your brain. So, and I witnessed this in Steve Newport, the Alzheimer's disease patient, when he consumed a medium chain triglyceride coconut oil mixture. He would light up, and this was years ago. This was like 2009 or 10 where I first saw this, and it was evidence to me that the substance that he took was stimulating brain energy metabolism. It actually prevented or silenced the fine tremors that he had too, and I thought that was kind of interesting and may have application for Parkinson's disease. But then there's signaling things that you mentioned too, and we are looking at, I guess adenosine and GABA would be signaling, but we are looking at inflammation. And we do basic, cytokine profile analysis of the blood and the tissues, even the muscle tissue. And we know that ketones function as histone deacetylase inhibitors, and an HDAC inhibitor can activate various genes that can be cellular or neuroprotective in that regard. So there's a lot of work being done on that because it can apply to longevity. So through the FOXO3A, there's various pathways that when they're activated, they can boost things like cellular resilience through superoxide dismutase, and it activates the body's own endogenous antioxidant mechanisms and cellular protection. That's a huge class of drugs right there, the histone deacetylase inhibitors. Most of the big pharmaceutical companies have a lot of money invested into developing these. And we know that ketones, classically known as endogenous metabolite, functions in this capacity independent of its effects on energy metabolism. So independent of the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle, it's working and altering pathways and functioning like a small molecule activator, inhibitor of various pathways. And that is data, that's stuff that has emerged in the last 5 or 6 years. So that didn't even exist when I started studying this. And now in pharmaceutical companies are taking a keen interest and actually have teams that are working on this to understand how they can, exploit this idea of taking a small molecule or beta hydroxybutyrate and seeing if they can create molecules that can do the same thing or do it better. And to my knowledge, they have not done that yet, but they have, active programs where they're working on that. And we have the ability to elevate that molecule ourselves with fasting, intermittent fasting, with diet, and now with exogenous ketones. So I find that interesting.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me too, where as I started reading more of the work you're doing and some of these different things, you think of what all these potential next steps are. It's like you hear, we know that inflammation can be an underlying mechanism to so many other things, even to just something as simple as like depression or something. And you think about, or even the utilization of GABA and all those different things. And you think that's what I think is so cool about looking at you're looking at so many of the ketogenic diets and exogenous ketones effects on these extreme situations, and then there's so many subcategories that it could potentially help for people, even if it's something as simple as milder depression or anxiety or something. So that seems
That's
really
a good
interesting.
point. Yeah, that's a good point, because I think a lot of people live with systemic inflammation, whether it be from an autoimmune disorder or a substance that's introduced into their body that's creating an autoimmune scenario. So to my knowledge, there's no useful role for autoantibodies like in the body. They always do something bad. So there are many people that have autoimmune disorders or that have viral disorders, like a chronic viral infection that may be causing systemic inflammation. That could be things like HIV or even herpes simplex or shingles, or these are things just running through my head from people who have emailed me that said the only thing that worked for them was fasting ketosis, nutritional ketosis, or even exogenous ketones. And we know the inflammatory state of our body will impact our brain. And I think that headaches may be due in part to neuroinflammation in the brain. And maybe it's not a coincidence that recently, there was some data presented at a conference showing that ketones, exogenous ketones, have a remarkable effect at reducing migraines and headaches. And that work is done by Elena Gross. She's studying the effects of ketones in a clinical trial, that registered clinical trial on people who have severe migraines. So migraines may be, some people argue that, or they debate what migraines are, but they may actually be like a mini seizure in the brain that's not manifested, as a tonic-clonic seizure. But we know, for example, an absence seizure is you just kind of space out, and you're not, it's not tonic-clonic activity associated with it, but the people can gradually come out of it. And maybe a headache is something along those lines. It's a bit of a mystery, but in any way, there was a number of people. There was enough feedback to motivate Elena Gross herself, who suffered from migraines and was helped by nutritional ketosis. There was enough feedback and scientific rationale to do a clinical trial on this. So it's another emerging application. Autism is another emerging application of the ketogenic diet, and there are several case reports that motivated clinical trials that are now being done, and a whole lot of animal studies too have been done and are being done now that help to kind of support and validate this approach to, at the very least, prevent many of the symptoms associated with autism. And similar to autism is a condition known as Angelman syndrome, and it's a genetic disorder that is the gene kind of impacts a house cleaning gene. The genetic disorder impacts that, and kids who have Angelman syndrome have seizures and they have impaired motor function, and the ketogenic diet works remarkably well in these kids that have seizures. So that's another area that we study. Our collaborators here at USF actually have a mouse model for Angelman syndrome, and we've published on that. And we didn't look at the ketogenic diet, but we did the ketone ester, and that had a remarkable effect at improving motor function and reducing the seizures associated with this in an animal model that's very close and pretty reflective of the disease process. So, and it's interesting because you have a genetic disorder that is highly responsive to nutritional ketosis, where it can treat the symptoms remarkably well, but you're not doing anything at the gene level that we know of in an acute way. Maybe, with persistent administration, it may be epigenetically making some changes, but I find it interesting that a metabolic-based therapy, a diet essentially that you can give, can relieve patients of the symptoms of a genetic disorder that's persistent and that's not changing while you're giving the therapy. So that, and that's the case with other things like glucose transporter deficiency, where there's an impaired glucose transport to the brain, and the ketones just kind of fill that gap and help to replenish the energy intermediates that the brain needs to function. So, this is just some of the applications on a number of emerging, and, when I started, as I mentioned, it was just pediatric epilepsy.
Right.
So now it's been really exciting to have gotten into this research. And I mean, I'm like 2 or maybe 5% of all the kind of new things that are being done, but investigators around the world, many in the United States, but even all around the world, are investigating these expanding applications of the ketogenic diet. And just one example of how a diet can have effects that are above and beyond drug-like effects, and for things that are, classically known as being untreatable, traditionally known as being untreatable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about a lot of this research involving exogenous ketones, and I'll attach to this podcast some resources you've done some really good podcasts going into kind of the basics of a lot of these things, so I'll kind of attach some of that for people. But for exogenous ketones, obviously being a huge benefit to people, so that way maybe if they're in a situation they don't have to adhere to a nutritional strict ketogenic diet or things like that. I know you've done some research on anxiety in a mouse or rat model with exogenous ketones. I know that if people Google exogenous ketones right now, they're going to come across a lot of different ketone salts. Usually it's, beta hydroxybutyrate spread across some different salts, things like that. And then a lot of research deals with ketone esters. Is there a big difference between the two in terms of applicability? And I guess if somebody sees, like, say, your study on exogenous ketones and anxiety, and they want to give, maybe ketones will benefit my anxiety, do they need to look for a specific type when they go looking at exogenous ketones? Could you maybe just explain some of the differences?
Yeah, sure. So in regard to that study, so my wife is a behavioral neuroscientist, and she works in psychology over on main campus here at University of South Florida. And when we were doing some studies, I guess it was with the seizure models or motor function, we were looking at motor function, she realized that when they were given an exogenous ketone, and not all exogenous ketones had this effect to this degree, she noticed that they're easier to handle. They ran faster on the rotorods or on the little treadmill device, so that was of interest. But they were generally just more relaxed and easier to handle. And when you handle, the rodents, and it's you recognize if something changes their fear behavior. So that's what we were experiencing when we were doing this. So the idea was her idea to let's do tests. Pharmaceutical companies use something called the elevated plus maze, where it's essentially like a catwalk, if you can envision a catwalk where you go out and you can fall off either side, right? It's relatively narrow, and you're open to the surrounding area. Or you could go back onto the catwalk-like thing and go into a little cave and hide. And that would be, more reflective of antisocial behavior, fear behavior. So exploratory behavior or a lack of fear behavior would be going out onto this catwalk, right? So my wife designed an experiment, and we worked together on this, and now she has got a whole program looking at that and a number of other things, where we did these studies where we looked at ketone salts, we looked at ketone ester, and we looked at the most effective supplement in the rodent model was the combination of ketone salts and medium triglyceride oil combined together in basically a 1-to-1 ratio. And then that was administered, we did it a couple different ways, but administered acutely. So as a gavage, which you just kind of essentially like a tube feeding the animal to get their ketone levels up high right before we do a number of video recordings on the elevated plus maze, and you can record like how many times they go in and out of the open arm versus closed arm. So it's a fairly complicated algorithm to analyze all this data. But the bottom line was that when it came to attenuating the fear response and being in the open arm, there was about a 25 to 30, I got to go back and look at the publication, amount of time that was increased in the rodents, the rats, in the open arm. So this is pretty significant. And when you compare it to various drugs that are used for anxiety, I think it may be like a better performer than that. So it'd be good to go back and
Unfortunately,
reproduce
they have set a
this.
very high bar, a lot of those medications.
Yeah, that's right. For things like, for like depression and other, for anxiety, we know that, if you give someone enough Valium or Xanax or something like that, you can do it, but you're impairing their performance. You're impairing, the ketones, the experiments that we were doing when we noticed this were them running faster on a treadmill-like device called a rotorod. And you can make it go slow, so you can look at endurance, or you can make it to accelerate over time, and that would be like sprinting. So, and in both of those things, they perform better, typically. It does depend on the dosage. It depends on the form you give them. So now we're interested in like combining an ester with a salt with a medium chain triglyceride, and then various cofactors, which would allow the body to use those ketones more effectively. And then maybe combining that with various forms of carbohydrates, so the PDH complex stays revved up, and you're enhancing glycolysis, and also enhancing the ketolytic pathways, and also enhancing the fat oxidation pathways. So it's kind of like a shotgun approach with cofactors that open up some of the pathways. So these are things that we're doing now. But I mean, getting back to that, application for anxiety behavior, which may be, of interest to a lot of people, being in a very kind of demanding environment, whether it be you're a CEO, whether you're a Navy SEAL, whether you're an astronaut, whether, in academia, we're put under enormous amounts of pressure to produce, to, get grants and teach and all this stuff that we got to do. It's pretty anxiety provoking, right? So I think I've always been kind of like even though I appear calm, always been kind of an anxious person when it comes to kind of more or less kind of, how do I say, I don't know how to put it, but just, I need a level of things need to get done in the course of a day, or else it puts anxiety.
I'm the same way.
At the end of the day, I write things down on paper, and if I'm not productive, that can contribute to anxiety, especially if there's deadlines on things. So in academia, there's always deadlines. And I find that nutritional ketosis, and my several colleagues and many people that I communicate with have told me that they are much more, their productivity goes up and their anxiety levels go down after they adopted this eating regimen. And a lot of it may have to do with, a few of them were doing frequent carbohydrate feedings with low fat, and their energy levels would fluctuate throughout the day. And when you stimulate, insulin in the middle of the day, and insulin goes up and you become hypoglycemic, your brain's going to tank, really. I mean, because especially if you're like mildly calorie restricted, a lot of that glucose is dumping into your peripheral tissues, and you're limiting glucose availability to the brain in some cases, or if it was a big meal and things like that. And that's how I remember it back before I started eating this way. And when I started eating this way, I gradually started eating less throughout the day. And now, like today, for example, I ate almost 12 hours ago, and will eat in probably another 2 hours or so. And I spread my meals apart, like about, from breakfast to dinner. And when I get to work, I get more done during the day, and I don't get hungry. And I think that's a big advantage of it. A disadvantage to maybe guys that are listening that are trying to gain weight is that it can be hard to gain weight on a ketogenic diet because your appetite is somewhat suppressed. But when I do, if I have a little extra time and I can hit the gym a little bit more and I want to gain a little bit more muscle, I just simply add another meal in the middle of the day. And it's usually something that's not going to, fluctuate my glucose levels, like some fish, some sardines, some steak, or something like that, some fatty protein in the middle of the day. And it's kind of easy, but ketogenic meals are very calorically dense. So for me, I mean, a plate of food is typically, if it fills up the same plate, can have twice the amount of calories that, a meal would be if it's like, rice and chicken or something. You can have some pretty dense meals on a ketogenic diet, and you can
Plus,
fill the gap and get your calorie needs that way a little bit
yeah.
easier.
Plus, you figure if you combine fat and salt, even if your appetite's
Yeah.
down a little bit, it tastes good enough that you should be able to eat a decent amount.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd be like, and I approach this from the perspective of talking with parents that try to transition their kids on a ketogenic diet if they're on anti-epileptic drugs. And some kids, and this may apply to some people, have like a fat intolerance, especially if they're not eating very low fat. If they're not eating fat and they're just adhere to a low fat diet, they become nauseous when they start eating the amount of fats needed to get the calories that they need.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a big guy, if you're a lifter, if your calorie needs are pretty high, I never had that problem though. I can just go and eat like a big fatty steak. I'm great with it. My body thrives off protein and fat. And when I take carbohydrates away, some people get the keto flu. Some people get a dramatic reduction in performance. I did get a little bit of headaches, in the beginning. I got really flat, the first 2 or 3 weeks. And then as I started just pumping in the calories, protein and fat and everything, I just started filling out more. My lifts took a little bit of a dip in the beginning, but then they came back. And now I'm not really looking to gain or anything like that at this point in time. So I'm just training, and I can maintain especially if I actually make it to the gym and get all my meals in and calories in, it's pretty easy to maintain the major lifts,
Right.
following this diet. And for a kid who's like 18, 19, or maybe in the early 20s, it might be kind of hard, especially if they have a fast metabolism. But, I like to go back in time and try it.
Yeah.
I did try what I thought was a ketogenic diet for cutting, when summer would roll around and I would, back in college, and I would say I was on a ketogenic diet or maybe something like that, and I would just basically be eating tuna fish out of a can and
Yeah.
and things like that, in water, and just dry chicken breast and things like that, and just cutting the carbs. But it was a high protein diet, but not a ketogenic diet. Probably why I felt like crap.
Yeah, and I guess like kind of these last few kind of on the practical side of things, I know that different effects can take different amount of time as you get adapted to a ketogenic diet. For a lot of these cognitive and some of these neurological brain effects of a ketogenic diet, I'm sure it differs from person to person, but how long typically do you think it takes people being in nutritional ketosis to start to see some of these effects, or what you've seen in the research you've done?
Yeah, I would say longer than you'd expect, or longer that has been reported, definitely more than a week. Although it's interesting that you do get a lot of benefits within a week. I mean, the diet can work and control seizures within a couple of days, which is really interesting to me because it's literally changing the way your brain is being fueled. But when it comes to like adapting your metabolism to the ketogenic diet, you got to figure like you're changing its entire fuel source. So that involves an entire different set of transporters and enzyme systems and mitochondrial biogenesis and epigenetic effects, through HDAC that we talked about. There's anti-inflammatory effects through the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is a big hub of a molecule that when it's activated, it causes, inflammatory cytokines to go up. And we know that ketones keep that suppressed, which may be important for different, especially chronic inflammatory diseases. And all these things kind of come in, later on after a couple weeks. And I think, at the minimum 6 weeks for your body to kind of feel, like this is something normal that you're doing for you to adapt. And for me, I mean, I kept getting benefits after 3 or 4 months. And I think a lot of it may be due to the learning curve of just figuring out how to count macros and how to, titrate my calories in. And then I was finding out foods work for me. I did a much higher dairy-based diet in the beginning, lots of butter and heavy cream. And as I progressed on, I found that I just felt better if I still keep dairy in my diet, but instead of getting 250 grams of fat from, butter and heavy cream, which is pretty easy to do if you want to, I get them from different sources now, and I feel better, I think. I definitely think, and it's reflected in some of my blood work too. Like my My inflammation is like really low. C-reactive protein is like, you know, 0.1, or it's non-detectable sometimes. And my triglycerides are always really low. My HDL came up a little bit from like 55 to like, you know, 75 or 80 or something like that. Not real high, but it came up. When I did follow a dairy-based diet, my LDL-P went really high. My LDL went up pretty high, and then that has come back down now that I get more of my fat from MCTs maybe, and then from I get most of my fat, if I think about it, through fatty fish. I eat a lot more fish than red meat. I was eating a lot of red meat in the beginning, and a lot of egg yolks. So I can go through a dozen eggs a day, a dozen egg yolks a day sometimes. And I don't know, I went a couple days without any eggs, but I do that. A lot of MCTs, some nut butters, and you know, just a variety. I try to vary it a lot more than I used to. I like to test out different oils and products that people send me too. So I'm testing a wide variety of different ketogenic foods. Mark Sisson's line is pretty good. I'm using all the different. He's got like an avocado-based mayonnaise, which is really good. Highly recommend that in his Primal pack.
Yeah,
so
that
that's
one Chipotle one I've been meaning to order. It sounded like it was really good. It was
Yeah,
like a Chipotle avocado mayo or something.
I've been enjoying that like the last couple of weeks. Like that's what I've been eating. I've been putting, you know, the sauces and mayo, and that's a great way to boost your fat intake. And it's monounsaturated, and I really feel, you know, if you were to take a plug of fat out of your subcutaneous fat and then analyze it, most of it's monounsaturated fat. And I think from my simple, you know, interpretation of that is that I think we should be eating like the fat that we're made out of, and not, you know, massive amounts of polyunsaturated or even massive amounts of saturated. Saturated, fine, but things like steak and egg yolks are actually mostly monounsaturated fat. Like an egg yolk, it's mostly oleic acid. And I have avocado oil and macadamia nut oil that I use in a lot of different things too. So I've been using those oils pretty religious. So I get and a lot of avocados too. So we live in Florida; it's pretty cheap down here, and we have avocado trees in the backyard. So.
Oh, that's great. I kind of wanted to wrap up with kind of for, you know, and this is kind of, I guess, selfishly, this is the situation I'm in. You know, if you have some people who say, we have a lot of listeners that compete in anaerobic sports, and say they want to utilize a nutritionally ketogenic diet to try to get some of these neurological, cognitive effects, anxiety, whatever their reasons are, but they're trying to balance, you know, making sure they're getting enough, you know, they're doing a modified ketogenic diet. So they're trying to get enough protein still. They're trying to still make sure they're getting enough, having enough muscle glycogen at times for some training. But on the flip side, they're also trying to balance that with realizing that high ketone levels is going to benefit them neurologically. What do you think are some ways that somebody trying to kind of balance that teeter-totter can try, and maybe some considerations they should keep in mind?
Well, I would say, you know, it's probably not the best thing, although I stay in nutritional ketosis all the time. From an evolutionary perspective, we're probably not meant to be in ketosis all the time. So to give it a shot and just put your body into intermittent ketosis here and there, ideally, if they're a competitive athlete, do it in the off season and let their body, and be pretty liberal with the calories too. Maybe not the best thing to try to like bulk up on a ketogenic diet, like when you're adding surplus calories, those calories have to go kind of somewhere, right? So I would just do it like kind of during a maintenance phase, or maybe even a cutting phase. Do a modified Atkins diet, you know, Google it, search it, and look at the macro ratios, you know, 65% fat, 70% fat, with the balance being protein and a minimal amount of, you know, fibrous carbs from green vegetables, and to use oils like MCT oil helps to further, you can get the ketone level of a classical ketogenic diet with a modified ketogenic diet simply by adding MCT oil. Quest Nutrition makes an MCT oil powder that's pretty good. I'll put it in my coffee pretty much every morning and in the afternoon. And simply, if you just take 1 or 2 scoops of MCT oil powder, and I've done this because I tested it, and just drink it and measure ketones, you get an extra 0.5 to 1 millimolar increase in that. And and I have to kind of plug, exogenous ketones because they've really, helped me. And the salt products are out there. So you have products like Ketogenics, the Prove It products, the Keto OS 2.0 Orange Dream is a product that has beta hydroxybutyrate salt and medium chain triglyceride combined together. And that's kind of like the formula that we've tested and validated the most in the lab. Ketologic, new company that come on. I have a link on my website, ketonutrition.org. And each one of the products, that I put on there are ones that we've tested in the lab. And it's like, right behind me, I've got tons of stuff. So we're testing things on ourselves, on myself, and in various studies in our rodent models pretty much on a daily basis. So I would tell people to experiment, with some of the ketone products that are on the market, especially when you transition to a ketogenic diet. I do think it's pretty catabolic. Like the first week to 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, maybe even longer than that, as your body, it's a stress to your body as you adapt. And the ketones' evolutionary role is really as a protein sparing effect, an anti-catabolic. I think of them, they're a molecule that's an anti-catabolic molecule to prevent muscle wasting during a situation with limited food availability. So you can sort of trick your body, if you want to biohack, whatever term you want to use, when you transition to a ketogenic diet. If you are boosting your ketone levels, you're preventing, what typically happens is kind of, higher than normal muscle catabolism over time, and you're suppressing insulin, so you're not really in an anabolic state, and you're really, this is just what happens when you're pushing your body from a glucose-based metabolism to a fat-oxidating, fat-burning metabolism. Once you're adapted and you're there, I think the body balances itself really well. And what I find is that, and I think you are much more resilient, if you were to fast or you were to go periods without eating, you don't get hungry, you have more energy, and I think your body is also protected from breaking down muscle in situations once you're fat adapted. So I find that that's really important. And even like I take time off of the gym routine because I travel a lot, and then sometimes I can jump back in and get 2 or 3, 4 days in, and my strength really doesn't decline much. And I think that has to do, whereas if I'm really adapted to a high carb diet and I skip a couple meals, I can feel it in my body, like I'm just chewing up muscle tissue. I think it's like extremely catabolic. Whereas if I'm adapted to eating ketogenic and I miss a couple meals and I miss a couple days of eating, like I can go into the gym and hit some numbers, because my energy level's there and I haven't really put my body into this stress response where it's really pulling off of its, muscle for energy. So I think that's a major benefit to me. It was my schedule is so crazy sometimes where I'm traveling, country, this country, that country, doing a red eye and having to give a talk the next morning, things like that. So that has helped me a lot. And then maybe a lot of your listeners too, who just have an erratic, schedule, I think it may help them too. But for me, the main thing is that I feel better, I have more energy. And
yeah, so it sounds like people, just understanding to be patient with the process is probably a big component to that as they transition.
Yeah.
If they've not been eating that way historically.
Yeah.
Do you think there's benefit in if somebody wanted to do a cyclic ketogenic diet to then, after they have the times where they load up on a few more carbohydrates, to then use exogenous ketones to help them shift back into their, ketogenic cycle or whatever? Or do you think that's kind of, I don't know, what do you think of that kind of approach if somebody wants to try that?
Yeah, I've been experimenting with that a little bit. So I lost a lot of weight to get, I was on the NASA NEMO mission, and I had to do a lot of swimming, which I sink like a rock. I'm very negatively buoyant. And I just wanted to get my body weight down just for the record, just to see kind of what happens. When I came out of that environment, it was the lowest ever. I was 207. And then I think I got my initial, all my tests done. I was maybe 219 or something like that. So I lost quite a bit of weight. And coming out of it, I was like, this is a good time to experiment with cyclic ketogenic diet. So instead of doing, 500-600 grams of carbs, like on the weekends or something like some people may do, I gave my body, on the days that I trained, whether it be legs or back, like the big multi-joint, like compound movements, I would have 2 refeeds a week. And the refeeds would just be more of the normal foods that I was eating, plus an extra 50 to 100 grams of carbs, typically from things like dark chocolate or blueberries or things like that. And just doing that made a difference. I think your body becomes so sensitive, your insulin sensitivity goes way up when you're on the ketogenic diet, that just doing something like adding an extra 50 to 100 to maybe 150 grams of carbs in, and then some extra protein. So I'd bump my total calories up 500 to 1,000 calories twice per week on the days that I did training. So yeah, it's training. And maybe I would do some kind of active recovery stuff on the days I didn't train, and that made a difference. So I've been slowly adding since the mission, almost by clockwork, like 1 pound per week. So I'm just back up to just about like 220 now, and we'll keep doing this and keep trying to add like about a pound a week for the next, a couple of weeks to months, and see what happens. So my version of the cyclic ketogenic, and that would kick me out of ketosis. So when I would eat dark chocolate, even the semi-sweet dark chocolate and some blueberries, or I'm testing a lot of different foods now. People send me different things, so I'm testing like now foods are pretty awesome stuff, and they've been sending me a lot of chocolate cookies. I'm testing foods from Legendary. I'm testing lots of the keto cookies. The keto cookie guys, you might have seen that. Yeah. I'm testing keto brownies, which is really low carb. So but I'm counting all the carbs on that. And these are foods that I'm experimenting with. And it's good to experiment with them because in many cases, I'm eating them in excess. And I'm also measuring things like my blood glucose. I'm measuring, actually I have some kits where I'm actually measuring my insulin response in response to some of these foods too, just to test them for people. And so I'm getting my carbs and extra calories in twice a week. And I've tried it the other way where I just eat whatever I want, either a meal or a day with cyclic ketogenic diet. And it's just, I don't like the roller coaster of going up and down. I like doing it. I'll figure out on paper, based on my body, based on objective metabolic biomarkers. I don't want my glucose going up to like 160, 170, 200 or whatever. I actually keep it almost like, it rarely goes above like 110 or 120, even when I eat these pretty big meals after. And normally it just stays about 70 to 80. So that's my method of doing it. After doing every sort of experiment on myself you can think about, right. My cyclic ketogenic diet is just throwing in extra food that I'm already eating and just adding an additional like snack foods, right. That are, fairly high fiber and, carbohydrates 50 to 150 grams extra on the refeed days.
And so say if you did, say, something like that, you have a couple extra hundred, or somebody has a couple hundred grams of carbs, and, it tops off some of their glycogen and things like that, and then they take something like exogenous ketones, so it kind of puts them back in a ketogenic state. When those ketones wear off, is there still kind of residual effects to having taken those ketones, even though you ate a whole bunch of carbs, or is it kind of just a temporary effect? And then you still have to burn off all those carbs that you ate as you try to get back into your nutritionally ketogenic state.
Yeah, so another project that we're doing, I didn't get to talk about it much, is that the ketones appear to enhance insulin sensitivity in ways that were just, there's reviews written by this, about this. I think Dr. Richard Veach from NIH kind of wrote some of the mechanisms that may be attributed to insulin-induced or ketone-induced enhancement of insulin sensitivity. My interpretation of some of the research is that it produces a mild calorie restriction effect, and that's always going to enhance insulin sensitivity. But what we have seen, without a doubt, and we've published on this and we're researching this more, is that if you take X amount of carbohydrates and consume it and measure your glucose response to that, it goes up and comes down. If you give that with ketones, the rise in glucose is less. And this is perhaps indicative of maybe decreased hepatic gluconeogenesis, increased insulin sensitivity. We don't really know. Actually, we're looking into it. I think to really understand it, you got to do liver metabolomics, and actually, feed it, and kind of maybe feed it chronically over time, harvest the liver tissue and do some metabolomics to see how some of the pathways are changing. Without a doubt, though. So it actually, I think there's maybe good rationale. We've been testing ketones mostly in the context of actually a standard diet, but we've also combining ketones with the ketogenic diet. And we've been testing it with a standard diet because that's really what the military wanted to do. They didn't want to change the warfighter diet. They just wanted to put ketones on top of it. And when we do that, invariably, we see a decrease in glucose. In some cases, it goes down to a really high dose of exogenous ketones. It goes down to like 30 or 40 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. And that's really low. That's giving a fairly high dose of something like a ketone ester. So this and the animals do not have any signs of hypoglycemia. So this is really interesting to us, and we didn't expect it, but we are studying it right now. So there does seem to be some value in adding ketones to your carbohydrate meals as a glucose disposal agent. I mean, I've done some studies where taking alpha lipoic acid with at various doses, and it's a supplement I still take with carbohydrate meals, and can attenuate that spike in glucose by about maybe 20%, or 10 or 20%, and ketones do that quite a bit more. So I'm not concerned about dumping ketones on top of food. I think when you do it, it may even shut off your metabolism. It might shut off not your metabolism, but your appetite a little bit, where you're just not that hungry.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
You have to factor that in. But it can feel, if you're knocked out of ketosis and then you're getting back into ketosis the next day after a refeed, I think the exogenous ketones may be a way to kind of give you a boost and kind of get your body up and going. Like I said, I think it's important to use a product that has beta-hydroxybutyrate and medium chain triglycerides, because when you consume them, the ketones are rapidly elevated from beta-hydroxybutyrate, but the medium chain triglycerides go right to your liver via the hepatic portal circulation. So it's almost like sending a bolus of fat to your liver. And what that does is it keeps revving up your fat oxidation in the liver. And that's important because you don't want to take you want to be making your own ketone production in addition to the exogenous ketones. And I feel it's important to deliver exogenous ketones with a substance that also revs up your own ketone production. And you're doing that when you take beta-hydroxybutyrate as a salt with medium chain triglycerides. And the fat from the MCTs helps to delay gastric absorption, so it extends the pharmacokinetic profile of the ketones, so it sustains it for longer. So we've shown that before. So these are just some tidbits of information I think may be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So I know we kind of went over a lot of stuff today. As I'm sure people can gather just from what we've talked about, this is an incredibly complex topic, and it's growing at a crazy rate. Just even from 5 years ago, the amount of research and information that people like yourself and others are doing is incredible. You mentioned your website briefly, but where's some more, if people are interested in what you're doing with your research and products and where this whole world is going with the neurological effects of the ketogenic diet and even beyond that, metabolic effects, where can they go to get more of the information?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've compiled information on keto nutrition, all one word, .org. So that's sort of like my information website on there. And on there, you'll find links to ketogenic foods. There's ketogenic diet consultants for epilepsy to seizures to athletic performance, a list of doctors on there. There's sources for ketone supplements on there. In the front page, I think I have a number of links for different products that I use, and those links have discounts to them. So you get 10, 20% off through discount codes that I have on there. So I would say go there is like that's the main stop. I think the Charlie Foundation website, if you're interested in the clinical applications of the ketogenic diet, it used to be the Charlie Foundation for Pediatric Epilepsy when I first discovered it, and now it's the Charlie Foundation, website, the ketogenic diet, basically for epilepsy, for pediatric epilepsy, and a host of other different pathologies. So, which is interesting. They've changed the website. Most importantly, for some people, they have recipes on there like how to make ketogenic brownies, how to make all these foods that are classically kind of like the comfort foods. So that has been useful to them. And the ketogenic diet resource, all one word.com, is one of the go-to websites that I recommend people go to. So ketonutrition.org, Charlie Foundation for clinical stuff, even recipes if you're not into it, and the ketogenic diet resource are kind of like my go-to websites.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you. And I think it's cool to see that the feasibility of living the lifestyle of ketogenic diet is becoming more and more realistic for people, especially for, it's one thing if you're using it just out of choice for something like fat loss or performance, but for people who have to use it for a condition, it's great that it's becoming, now you can get like quote unquote normal foods that allow you to still pursue that. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fun to be able to test those foods too. So
yeah, absolutely.
A lot of companies, are coming out with foods that I test that are not ketogenic, they're not low carb. So I think it doesn't, I'm a fan of just low carb. It doesn't have to be ketogenic, which is pretty strict, restrictive diet. But the products that I've tested that I like, that taste good, that has to pass like the taste test of my wife too, which is pretty hard. And if I test something and she's like, don't put that on your website because it doesn't taste good, but I like it. So it's like, so the things on my website are pretty legit things that I've tested. Maybe about 10% of the stuff that I test actually make it to the website. And so I would recommend those things. I kind of put my name behind them for foods. And there is a gap to fill for prepackaged ketogenic meals. And we're working, talking with different companies to make that a reality. And I think that's going to be a really good, something that's really important for people, clinically and for weight loss and even for athletic performance to have prepackaged ketogenic meals. They could pick a la carte what they want. It's sent to their house. They have a whole week of food. They don't have to weigh out, measure ratios of things. They know if they eat this, they get into a state of nutritional ketosis, and it's, it's quality food, and it's hopefully like feasible from a financial standpoint. And so there's some companies out there doing this, and they should be available pretty soon, if not already, actually.
That's great. Well, thank you, Dom, for chatting. That was a ton of great information. I think if nothing else should really pique some good interest in seeing, I think if people have only thought of ketogenic diet in maybe one context, they could see that there's a lot to it. So thank you for taking the time to chat about this today.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.